For 25 centuries, history's most rigorous thinkers have constructed formal systems that inevitably collide, fracture, and produce irreconcilable paradoxes. These collisions occur not because the logic is flawed, but because the systems are incomplete. This 3D mathematical manifold assigns these traditions distinct spatial coordinates. Within this single structure, the contradictions vanish. Every major philosophical school reaches a high degree of accuracy within the limits of its isolated position. To see how these isolated points connect, we must use information geometry. It is the study of how information can be measured and structured as geometric objects, allowing us to see how isolated data points form a single coherent structure. Systemic philosophical conflict is an illusion created by taking a localized coordinate and treating it as the whole. It is the error of a blind observer touching a single edge of a high-dimensional geometry and assuming they have measured the entire object. The structure measured is the Totality Event Vector, or TEV, the continuous mathematical trajectory of all cause, effect, and meaning defining reality. Because finite consciousness cannot process continuous infinity, the brain renders this flowing trajectory into frozen snapshots called Totality Event Frames, or TEF. This process creates a universal failure mode known as Hamartia. Hamartia is an archery term for missing the mark, and here it describes a structural failure of calibration, mistaking the limits of a frozen snapshot for the actual boundaries of the territory. Every major paradox and systemic collapse in history traces back to this single, invisible error of false completion. An observer reaches the edge of their rendering resolution and incorrectly records that edge as a feature of the territory itself. Around 500 BCE, Heraclitus identified the continuous nature of reality. He stated that everything flows and that you cannot step into the same river twice, closely describing the uninterrupted trajectory of the TEV. His contemporary, Parmenides, observed the exact opposite. He deduced that at maximum resolution, existence has no contradictions, no empty space, and no motion. He concluded that being is one. Parmenides accurately described the maximum resolution of a frozen snapshot, but he mistook that snapshot for reality itself. This error birthed 2,000 years of false metaphysical paradoxes regarding the impossibility of motion. Ancient metaphysical warfare was simply a discrepancy in rendering resolutions. When plotted correctly on the z-axis, the conflict between flux and stillness is instantly resolved. The difference between these resolutions is determined by the U matrix. The U matrix is the internal rendering apparatus that translates raw signals into a structured model of the world. In the 18th century, Immanuel Kant mapped this architecture. He proved the mind is not a blank slate, but actively structures experience through distinct categories like causality, substance, and time. In 1948, Shannon formalized this exact rendering constraint at the physical layer. He defined information entropy as a physical limit on how much information a channel can carry, identifying the source of semantic friction. Both men mapped the instrument with high fidelity. However, both failed to map what exists beyond the instrument's ceiling. They reached the edge of the human rendering capacity and stopped. Mapping the rendering instrument is necessary to reduce error, but it is insufficient for reaching truth. You cannot find the ground of reality solely by studying the lens used to view it. Every highly rigorous logical system eventually hits a self-sealing problem. The tools used to verify the system are themselves products of the system's own rules. Bertrand Russell identified the first crack in the foundation of pure logic. He found a system including itself as a member generates an unresolvable contradiction. David Hume encountered the same boundary in empirical observation. He proved no finite number of sensory observations can rationally justify a universal law. Alan Turing located this limit in computational systems. He proved no machine can determine from within its own code whether its computation will ever terminate. Gödel's incompleteness theorems provide the mathematical proof. No complex system can ground its own axioms from within. Popper's falsification approaches this asymptote, but cannot pierce it. To cross the final gap, truth must be received from an outside source. Epistemology simply cannot bootstrap itself to completion. At the asymptotic limit, the observer reaches a hard ceiling where information must be accepted from a higher resolution source. This structural limit applies to human action through the hegemonic grid. This is the moral plane of the framework, mapping the vector and direction of force. Karl Marx correctly diagnosed a specific moral coordinate: historical materialism. He identified how resource extraction is often disguised as neutral exchange. Michel Foucault provided a similar diagnostic for power structures. He mapped how social discourse is used to centralize power and produce docile subjects. This maps their diagnostics into the greatest lie quadrant. This is the zone where active energy extraction is presented to society as a universal benefit. While their diagnostics of extraction were accurate, both men blinded themselves to the positive vector. By excluding the upper densities of generative action, they produced models that were structurally distorted. Accurate socio-political diagnostics lead to normative paralysis when they exclude the possibility of positive direction. Without napping the upper densities of action, the observer identifies the corruption but remains incapable of providing a cure. This matrix unifies 36 warring schools of human thought. By locating each observation at its correct spatial coordinate, the historical collisions disappear. Despite millennia of surface-level conflict, the history of human thought has been a process of independent triangulation. These traditions have successfully identified 10 structural observations about the nature of reality. These observations follow a rigorous logic. Truth must be received, meaning is observer-dependent, reality is continuous, and the observer renders reality in snapshots. Human intellectual history has not been a series of failures. It has been the successful identification of the load-bearing structural laws of reality. These 10 structural discoveries demonstrate a structural correspondence with an ancient text, the Decalogue, or the Ten Commandments. When mapped side by side, the discoveries of modern logic align with the mandates of the ancient world. The Decalogue provides the rigorous boundary conditions required for a finite rendering system to maintain contact with reality. These are not behavioral norms, but the operating instructions for a functioning observer. Consider Commandment 2, the prohibition against graven images. This is the structural defense against the rendering error, the prohibition against mistaking a static, frozen snapshot for dynamic, continuous reality. Consider Commandment 8, the prohibition against theft. This maps to the Gödel limit. It is the prohibition against claiming a conclusion without derivation, the attempt to steal a truth that the system cannot mathematically ground from within. Truth is not reached by assuming your worldview is a complete totality. Truth is maintained by acknowledging your coordinate is strictly less than 1. Refuse the closed system and keep your internal architecture open to transmission.